Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a potential controversy brewing around former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And for this one, we've got two really interesting sources. We're looking at a Reddit thread that's been making the rounds on the Unusual Whales subreddit. For those who might not know, that's like a hub for folks who track, market-moving financial and political news. And we're also going to be diving into an investigative article from Real Clear Investigations, RCI. Now, it seems like Paul Pelosi's stock trades always make headlines, right? But this RCI investigation suggests that, well, there might be more to the story than just savvy investment choices. They're alleging that a number of businesses that have connections to the Pelosis ended up receiving millions in COVID-19 relief funds. So are we talking about like really sharp business moves or something that's, a little more ethically questionable? Let's try to unpack all of this. So RCI really zeroes in on one business in particular, the Auberge du Soleil. It's this luxury resort in Napa Valley. We're talking like $2,000 a night rooms, the kind of place that caters to, celebrities and tech giants.
What's interesting here is that if you look at their financial disclosures, the Pelosi family's investment in the Auberge, it rarely generated any substantial profits. But that picture changed really drastically in 2021. Their reported income from the resort jumped to a range of, get this, $1 million to $5 million. And coincidentally or not, that's the same year the resort received millions in COVID-19 relief funds.
Wait, hold on. So you're telling me this, like, fancy resort got a bailout? I thought those funds were supposed to help businesses that were really struggling, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what a lot of people are asking. RCI, they claim that the Auberge received something like $9 million from all these different pandemic relief programs. Now, I mean, the resort did close for a little while at the very beginning of the pandemic, but it bounced back pretty quickly. So was this a situation where a business got funds it didn't actually need?
Okay. And it sounds like it wasn't just the Auberge. RCI's investigation, it highlights other ventures linked to the Pelosis that also benefited from that COVID relief. And we're talking a grand total of around $28 million. Like, there's this one, the Piatti restaurant company, they got a pretty big chunk of change, something like $15 million.
And it's kind of interesting how, just like with the Auberge, the Pelosi's income from Piatti also saw a noticeable increase in 2021. The same year, it got most of that government assistance. The report says their income from the restaurant chain shot up to $1 million, compared to less than $50,000 in the years before.
So we've got these businesses. Some might say they weren't exactly struggling getting all this COVID relief money. And at the same time, the Pelosis are seeing a huge boost in their income from these same businesses.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, did these businesses really need those funds, or did they benefit because they were connected to, a powerful political figure?
Okay, so this is getting pretty interesting. Now, RCI does mention that there's like no evidence that says the Pelosis did anything illegal. But they did interview some ethics experts who said this whole situation raises some concerns about, potential conflicts of interest.
Yeah, and I think what's important to take away from this is that it really highlights how complicated these large-scale government aid programs can be and the complexities around like overseeing them and the ethical implications.
All right, so let's switch gears for a second and dive into that Reddit thread on Unusual Whales. It seems like this RCI investigation really set off a pretty heated debate.
Yeah, it's a real mix of different opinions, kind of mirrors what you see in the general public, I guess. Some users are, straight up calling for investigations. They're saying there's like clear evidence of corruption. But then there are others who argue that, hey, tons of businesses got COVID relief funds, including those owned by other politicians, and there's no proof that the Pelosis did anything wrong specifically.
There was this one comment that really stood out to me. It suggested that this whole situation might actually explain why Pelosi was hesitant to put Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the House Oversight Committee.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one too. It's kind of interesting, right? Because that committee, they're the ones who look into potential wrongdoing within the government, which includes how funds are allocated. So the commenter was speculating that Pelosi might have been worried about scrutiny of the COVID relief funds that went to businesses linked to her if, AOC, who's been critical of these programs, was on that committee.
That's a pretty thought-provoking connection. I mean, it makes you think about how when politicians have financial ties to businesses that could benefit from government programs, it creates this like potential for conflicts of interest, whether it's perceived or real.
Yeah, transparency is really key in situations like this. The more open politicians are about their financial interests, the less room there is for, speculation and concern.
Okay, so let's look at the other side of the argument for a second. What are the people who think the Auberge du Soleil and Piatti restaurant company were justified in getting those COVID relief funds saying?
Well, some of the folks in the Reddit thread are saying that these businesses were hit hard by the pandemic, just like tons of other businesses in the hospitality sector. They point out that lockdowns and travel restrictions led to closures and job losses. And, that affected businesses of all sizes.
Yeah, but RCI does say that while the Auberge du Soleil did close for a bit at the start of the pandemic, it recovered pretty quickly. So the question is, was that rebound strong enough to justify getting millions in relief funds that were, paid for by taxpayers?
That's the thing, right? What we don't have is a really detailed breakdown of how these businesses were doing financially during the pandemic. Without that information, it's tough to say for sure whether the amount of relief they got was actually necessary.
That's a really good point. It's not just about whether a business got funds. It's about whether the amount they got was, in line with the actual economic hardship they faced.
Right.
And that's where those oversight mechanisms come into play. Were the systems in place actually effective in making sure these funds were distributed fairly and efficiently?
Yeah, the Reddit thread touches on that too. You see a lot of users expressing frustration with the lack of transparency and accountability around how those COVID relief funds were handed out. Some people are even saying that the whole process was rushed and it didn't have enough safeguards to prevent things like fraud or abuse.
And it seems like that feeling cuts across party lines, right?
Yeah.
You see comments from people who identify as liberal, conservative, independent, all saying they're worried about how these funds are handled.
It definitely points to a larger feeling of disillusionment with how the government responded to the pandemic. There's a sense among some that, maybe those in power took advantage of the crisis to benefit themselves or their allies.
I mean, we have to remember that these are just allegations. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions without, solid evidence. But it's pretty clear that this issue has really resonated with the public. It's raising some big questions about ethics, transparency, and accountability in government.
Absolutely. This whole situation just underscores how important it is to have really robust oversight, especially when you're dealing with huge sums of public money. And it also emphasizes the need for clear ethical guidelines for politicians, particularly when it comes to their financial interests and how those interests could, potentially intersect with their policy decisions.
That's a perfect segue to the real heart of RCI's investigation: the potential conflict of interest created by the Pelosi's financial ties to these businesses. And RCI doesn't shy away from this point. They point out that as Speaker of the House, Pelosi was a key player in shaping the very legislation that authorized these COVID relief programs.
Right, and that's where the ethical considerations become really important. Did the Pelosi's benefit financially from policies that Pelosi herself, championed? And if so, does that constitute a conflict of interest, even if no laws were technically broken?
RCI actually quotes an ethics expert who says that even if there's no proof of illegal activity, this whole situation raises some valid concerns. The expert even suggests that just the appearance of a conflict of interest can erode public trust and damage faith in government.
Exactly. Even if it just looks bad, it can do a lot of damage. That's why transparency and accountability are so crucial. When politicians are upfront about their financial interests, it helps address those concerns and build trust with the public.
Now, RCI also delves into the Pelosi's wealth and how it's grown so much during Pelosi's time in office. They cite sources like Fortune magazine, which has reported on Paul Pelosi's successful stock trading, especially in, tech stocks. They even mention an analysis from Unusual Whales. Remember that website that monitors congressional trading? It indicated that the Pelosi's got some really remarkable returns on their investments just last year.
Yeah, I mean, that financial success combined with the whole COVID relief funds thing definitely fuels suspicion among some that the Pelosi's might be using their political position for personal gain.
Right, and whether they intended to or not, it seems like RCI is kind of playing into that narrative.
I think it's important to say that there's nothing inherently wrong with politicians being wealthy or good investors.
Yeah.
But the question is, are their financial interests influencing their policy decisions, and does that create a conflict of interest?
And that brings us right back to the need for transparency and accountability.
Definitely. The more transparent politicians are about what they're doing financially, the less room there is for suspicion.
RCI's investigation, even though it focuses on the Pelosi's, really taps into this larger issue that's been impacting American politics for years. This whole thing about the influence of money, the potential for corruption, and how public trust in our institutions is eroding.
It's a systemic problem,
Yeah.
and it needs systemic solutions.
But like what? What
Yeah.
kind of solutions are we talking about?
Well, you've got things like campaign finance reform, stricter ethics rules for politicians, and increased transparency in government. Those are all really important steps toward restoring public faith in our democracy.
That's a crucial point. This goes beyond any one politician or political party. It's about the integrity of our entire political system and making sure it works for all Americans, not just the wealthy and powerful.
It's about ensuring that our democracy truly represents the people it's supposed to serve.
I think that's a great point to move on to the second part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground here. Now, I want to focus on some specific details about those COVID relief programs that benefited the businesses linked to the Pelosi's.
Yeah, let's take a closer look at how those programs were designed, how the funds were distributed, and what oversight mechanisms were in place. We can also examine the arguments from people who think these businesses deserve that aid, and the counterpoints from those who see it as a potential abuse of power.
Stay tuned for part two, where we'll continue unraveling this complex and controversial issue.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of these COVID relief programs.
Sounds good to me. RCI focuses on a few specific ones, like the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, the COVID-19 Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. Could you give us a quick rundown of how those worked? Like, what was their purpose?
Sure. So the PPP, that was part of the CARES Act, back in March 2020. And it was designed to give forgivable loans to small businesses so they could, keep their employees on payroll during the pandemic. It was all about preventing massive layoffs, like a lifeline for businesses.
So it was really about job preservation at a time when, things were super uncertain.
Exactly. Then you've got the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, or EIDL, also aimed at small businesses, but instead of forgivable loans, they offered low-interest loans. And those could be used for a bunch of different expenses: operating costs, rent, debt payments, that sort of thing.
Got it. And the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, that sounds pretty self-explanatory, right? Helping restaurants specifically.
Yeah, that one came a little later, March 2021, part of the American Rescue Plan Act. It was all about grants to restaurants that had lost revenue because of the pandemic. They were really hit hard by all the lockdowns and restrictions.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, RCI's investigation says that businesses tied to the Pelosi's got money from all three of these programs.
Yeah, and they're saying the total amount was significant, around $28 million.
They also mentioned that Congress actually made the rules for the PPP stricter after the first round of funding.
Oh, that's right. They put in a rule that said companies couldn't get loans if lawmakers or their spouses owned a controlling interest. And that was defined as like owning at least 20% of the company. So it seems like they were trying to, deal with potential conflicts of interest.
Seems like a good step, at least in theory. But RCI also points out that the Pelosi's financial disclosures didn't list any of the businesses that got those PPP loans.
Right, which implies that maybe their ownership in those businesses was less than that 20% threshold.
So it kind of makes you wonder, did these businesses get those loans purely because they needed them? Or did the Pelosi's connections maybe play a role?
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure without more information about each business's finances.
Totally. Now, RCI really focuses on two businesses in particular, the Auberge de Soleil and the Piatti Restaurant Company. And they highlight how, in both cases, the Pelosi's reported income from those businesses went way up in 2021, the same year they got all that COVID relief money.
It's certainly interesting timing.
That's one way to put it. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. What are the people who think these businesses were actually entitled to this aid saying?
Well, some folks are saying that regardless of the Pelosi's, these businesses were affected by the pandemic just like any other business in the hospitality industry. They point out that the Auberge du Soleil did have to close for a while at the beginning of the pandemic. Their argument is that even luxury resorts can struggle during a global crisis.
I mean, yeah, the pandemic hit everyone hard.
Exactly. It was a completely unprecedented situation that, disrupted every industry.
RCI does acknowledge that the Auberge du Soleil closed for a bit, but they also emphasize that it bounced back relatively quickly, and they question whether that recovery was strong enough to justify getting millions in relief funds.
Right. It's a good question. And it gets to the heart of the debate. Were these relief programs really well targeted? And were there enough safeguards in place to prevent, waste or abuse?
Speaking of oversight, did RCI find any evidence of potential problems there?
Well, they do mention a few things that suggest there might have been some issues. For example, they cite this report from the Associated Press that estimated something like over $280 billion might have been stolen from pandemic relief programs through fraud.
Whoa, that's a huge amount.
It is, and they also mention a Senate report that highlighted instances of funds being misused, like spent on luxury items and things that weren't really essential.
Yikes. Those examples are pretty worrying. It makes
Yeah.
you wonder if maybe the rush to get those funds out the door overshadowed the need for, proper due diligence and oversight.
It's easy to see why people would feel that way. When you hear about taxpayer money being potentially wasted, it erodes trust in the government.
For sure. It can definitely make people feel like the system isn't fair. Now, I want to shift gears a little and talk about the ethical side of this whole thing. RCI talked to some ethics experts who weighed in on the potential conflict of interest with the Pelosi's connections to these businesses.
Yeah, one expert said that even if no laws were broken, even the appearance of a conflict of interest can be damaging. It creates this perception that politicians might be, using their positions for personal gain instead of serving the public. And that can be really, really harmful.
It's a really important point. That perception, even if nothing wrong actually happened, can really damage public trust and weaken our democracy.
Absolutely. Another expert suggested that the Pelosi's actions kind of raise questions about their priorities. Are they really putting the public first? Or are they more focused on their own finances?
It's a tough question to ask, but it's one that people are asking.
It is. And you see that sentiment in some of the comments on Reddit, too. There's a lot of anger and resentment, with some people accusing the Pelosi's of hypocrisy and greed.
Some even compare it to insider trading scandals, saying the Pelosi's might be using their knowledge and influence to make money.
We have to remember, though, that these are very serious allegations. We shouldn't jump to conclusions without solid evidence.
I agree. But it's clear that these allegations, whether they're proven or not, have made people even more skeptical and distrustful of those in power.
And that distrust, as we've talked about, can have serious consequences for our democracy.
It can make people feel like their vote doesn't matter, like the system is rigged against them.
Exactly. Now, it's worth noting that RCI doesn't just focus on the COVID relief funds. They also look at Pelosi's wealth overall and how much it's grown while Pelosi was in office.
Right. They talk about Paul Pelosi's success in the stock market, especially with tech companies. They even mention that analysis from Unusual Whales, the website that tracks congressional freighting, showing that the Pelosi's had some really impressive returns on their investments last year.
Yeah, and when you put that financial success together with the COVID relief funds issue, it really feeds into the narrative that the Pelosi's might be using their political power for personal enrichment.
It's a narrative that's hard to ignore, for sure.
It is. But again, there's nothing wrong with politicians being wealthy or good at investing.
Yeah, of course. Everyone's entitled to build wealth.
The question is whether their financial interests are affecting their decisions as politicians and whether that's creating conflicts of interest.
Which takes us back to the need for transparency and accountability.
Absolutely. The more transparent politicians are about their finances, the less room there is for suspicion.
So RCI's investigation, while it's focused on the Pelosi's, really points to this bigger issue that's been a problem in American politics for decades. It's about the influence of money, the potential for corruption, and the erosion of public trust in our institutions.
It's a systemic problem that needs systemic solutions.
What kind of solutions are you thinking of?
Things like campaign finance reform, stricter ethics rules for politicians, more transparency in government, those are all crucial for rebuilding public faith in our democracy.
That's a really important point. This goes beyond just one politician or party. It's about the integrity of our whole political system, making sure it works for all Americans.
It's about making sure our democracy actually represents the people it's supposed to serve.
I think that's a great place to transition to the last part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground here. Now, I want to focus on what we can actually do about this. Like, what are some potential solutions and ways to move forward?
Yeah, let's explore some of the reforms that people have proposed to address conflicts of interest, increase transparency, and make the government more accountable. And we can also talk about what we as citizens can do to demand change and hold our elected officials accountable.
Join us for the third and final part of this deep dive, where we'll continue to unpack this complex and really important issue. Okay, so we've looked at the allegations, dug into the COVID relief programs, and really wrestled with the ethical stuff. What can we actually do about all of this? Like, what's the path forward?
That's the big question, right? I mean, RCI makes it clear there's no evidence of anything illegal happening, so criminal charges don't seem likely at all.
Right. That makes sense. But a lot of people on Reddit are saying that even if no laws were broken, there should still be some accountability for ethical lapses, especially for people in positions of power.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to a desire for more integrity in government. Like, there's this feeling that the system lets those in power get away with things, and that's a problem.
It definitely raises questions about fairness and whether everyone is playing by the same rules. And as we've said, that can really erode trust in democracy, the institutions that are supposed to be working for the people. So what are some real tangible things we could do to address these concerns?
One thing that comes up a lot is making the ethical rules for politicians stronger. So, stricter limits on outside income, tougher disclosure rules, and harsher penalties for breaking those conflict of interest rules. The idea is to have real consequences for ethical missteps.
Those sound pretty reasonable to me. But don't some politicians argue that all those restrictions would discourage good people from running for office?
I think it's a valid point, something to consider for sure. But we have to balance that against the need for public trust in government. If people believe politicians are just looking out for themselves, it's really damaging to democracy. It's all about finding that balance.
Right, it's about earning that trust. Campaign finance reform is another big one that always comes up.
Totally. The idea there is to reduce the influence of money in politics. The hope is that it makes politicians less beholden to special interests and more responsive to their constituents.
That could be huge, right? I mean, a lot of people believe that wealthy donors and corporations have way too much sway over policy decisions.
And that feeling fuels the sense that the system is rigged, that regular people don't matter, that their concerns aren't being addressed.
It creates a feeling of powerlessness. So campaign finance reform could maybe level the playing field and help restore some of that lost trust. Beyond these bigger reforms, though, there's also the question of holding individual politicians accountable. What can we as citizens actually do, legally and ethically, to hold their feet to the fire?
It's a tough one, right? It's easy to feel powerless against a system that seems unresponsive to everyday people.
It can be really discouraging. How do we actually make a difference?
I think one of the most important things is staying informed and engaged, following the news, doing your own research on candidates, and participating in the political process.
Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. An informed citizenry is the foundation of a healthy democracy. And we also have to demand transparency from our leaders, push for more disclosure of things like financial interests, lobbying, campaign contributions. Transparency means more scrutiny, which makes it harder for wrongdoing to hide.
So shining a light on those dark corners, basically. And if we find evidence of wrongdoing, we have to speak up, right?
Absolutely. Whether it's contacting our representatives, organizing protests, supporting investigative journalism, using social media, we have to make it clear that we won't tolerate unethical behavior and abuse of power. Our leaders need to know we're watching.
It's a reminder that we do have a voice and we have to use it. We can't just sit back and hope the system fixes itself.
Exactly. Ultimately, protecting our democracy is the responsibility of both our leaders and us, the citizens.
It's a partnership, in a way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We have to demand better from our leaders, but we also have to hold ourselves accountable, participate, and make our voices heard.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. It's definitely a reminder of the challenges our democracy faces, but it's also a call to action. We can't be complacent. We have to get involved, demand transparency and accountability, and work to create a system that serves all Americans.
I completely agree. The future of our democracy depends on us being engaged and committed to justice, fairness, and accountability.
Well said. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. It's been enlightening.
It's been great discussing this with you.
And to our listeners, until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.